Hello, everybody. We're doing the session a bit differently from the way it's been introduced. We'll do a kind of conversation between the two of us where we'll both introduce ourselves and our work and our entry into feminism and the vexed issue of sex work or women in prostitution. So that's how we will proceed, and we'll leave about 20 to 25 minutes for questions and answers with the audience. So please treat this session as a conversation taking place on stage here and then amongst all of us as we go along. So good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you're having a very good festival. Welcome to the Dhaka Lit Festival for those who've come for the first time. But let me start by asking Ruchira to introduce herself and the many-faceted works that she does to all of you.
Thank you, Firdaus. My own journey began as a journalist. About 18 years ago, I was traveling through the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of villages which didn't have any girls from age 15 to 45, it seemed like. And I began to ask the men who were sitting in the villages, drinking tea, playing cards, where all the girls were. And some of them were hostile, some were sheepish, some just walked away. But a few answered, and they said, "Don't you know they all are in Bombay?" And that was really puzzling because Bombay was about 1,400 kilometers away. And these villages were so remote that women had to walk 2 hours to get to the highway. So I couldn't understand how so many could be in Bombay. As a good journalist, I began to look for the answer. And the answer changed my life. Because what I found was that in these villages, there was a smooth supply chain from these villages to the brothels of Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, which started from a local village procurer, who could be an uncle, a neighbor, a brother, who would go to poor, starving farmers and offer them some money or say they would get their daughters a job in the big city. And at the same time, he would say, if not a job, we might even put her into prostitution or get her married. Now, these farmers were so isolated and so innocent that they didn't understand what the full consequences of prostitution was. And they thought at least it meant a meal and a bed and some money coming back home. So they would let their daughters go. And these girls were normally between the ages of 9 and 13. And these girls were taken by these procurers to the big cities of Kathmandu, Biratnagar, Hitoda, where they were clustered together. And then 2 or 3 girls were taken to the border. There were the corrupt border guards. Wink, wink, nod, nod, and the girls were smuggled across the border. On the other side were the lodges, plastic sheets, corrugated cement sheets. And these girls were kept there for 2 or 3 days, locked up, beaten, starved, told they were devalued, till their spirits were completely subjugated. And then they were given over to a set of transporters. These transporters would put them on buses and trucks and take them to the big brothels of Bombay and Calcutta. There were the pimps who would negotiate the price of the girls depending on their beauty. Now, by beauty, what do I mean? Fair skin was at a premium. Being voluptuous was at a premium. The younger, the better. The youngest I have met is a 7-year-old, and ice was used to break her because she hadn't even menstruated till then. And then these pimps would take the girls for maybe 10,000 rupees, 5,000 rupees, and hand her over to the brothel manager. The brothel manager would put these girls into these small, in Bombay, the brothels are like chawls. So they are up small wooden staircases, and there are rows of rooms which share toilets at the end. And each room has iron bars on the window, and each room had a door. So locks are on the door normally, and there are iron bars on the window, 4 or 5 beds stuffed into each room. These girls were pushed in there, and for the next 4 or 5 years, they were brought out to service 8 or 10 customers every night. And they were told that they were repaying the debt that their fathers had incurred. And they lost count. They didn't know how to count. So, the debt might have been repaid in 2 nights. But they just were used constantly for the next 5 years. Behind the brothel managers were the landlords, the money lenders, and finally the organized criminal networks. So when I saw this, as a woman, I was outraged. I felt that as a woman, I could not bear what was happening, this repeated body invasion and this deliberate exploitation. As a journalist, I'd covered war and famine and hunger and ethnic and caste conflict, but I'd never seen this kind of deliberate exploitation of one human being by another. So I was determined that, I would tell the story because I felt that this needed to be exposed. Because till then I'd believed that prostitution was like a win-win situation, where some poor women would make some money and some poor migrant workers would get some sex in exchange. But what I saw in this was it was a system where the woman was kept in debt bondage. There were lots of people living off her, and it wasn't at all a win-win. She was getting deeper into debt. So I decided to make a documentary as a good journalist and tell the story. Making the documentary took me 18 months, but I also changed my life because I went deep into the villages. I spent a lot of time talking to the women in prostitution inside the brothels of Bombay. And the friendships that I formed there made me determined that I wanted to do something more. So the documentary got made thanks to the courage of the women, because at one time somebody even pulled out a knife on me when I was shooting inside the brothels. And it was about 22 women who surrounded me and tried to save me. And they told this man who had pulled a knife out that we have decided to tell our story to her. And if you want to kill her, you've got to kill us first. And that man slunk away, thinking it would be too much trouble to kill 23 women. So their circle saved me, and I did end up making the documentary, won an Emmy, but I felt it was all really irrelevant. But I didn't really know what I wanted to do, because I was trained as an English literature student, and I wasn't a lawyer, I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a social worker, public health specialist, nothing. So with the Emmy, I went back to Bombay, showed the documentary to the women, and I said, I won an Emmy, but I don't really know what I'm going to do with this Emmy. So they said, you've got to help us start something to educate our children. Because whatever has happened to us has happened, but we don't want the same destiny for our daughters. Because what happened at that time inside the brothels of Bombay was that as the women began to get older, which is in the late 20s, early 30s, the brothel managers would tell them to replace themselves with their daughters, because they wanted Naya Mal. The customers wanted Naya Mal, and they did not want older women who looked like cardboard creatures because they'd been so used up. So they wanted to save their daughters, and with that premise, we started Apne Aap, the NGO that Firdaus spoke about. Apne Aap, as you all know, means self-empowerment in Hindi. And there's a Bangladeshi link to the word Apne Aap. Many years ago, I had come to visit Bangladesh as a journalist, and I stayed with Khushi Kabir. And her NGO was called Nijera Kori. And her whole method of organizing the women was something which had an impact on me. So when I went back and started Apne Aap with the women in prostitution in Bombay, that was something at the back of my mind, and that's why we chose the word Apne Aap, that we would organize, form circles, and try to campaign to access rights for ourselves and our daughters to change our lives. So that was basically the premise, and at that time the women had 4 dreams, Firdaus. School for their children. The second dream was a job in an office. And I asked the women, I said, what does a job in an office mean to you? Because it was so remote from the reality of the chawl in Bombay. And they said, oh, well, we have 9 to 5 fixed hours. We have old age pension where nobody will shout at us and abuse us and kick us. And the third thing they said was they wanted a room of their own, just like Virginia Woolf. And that was also so surprising because I said, what does a room of your own mean? They said, where we can sleep for as long as we want. Nobody can walk in when they want, where our children can play safely on the floor. And the fourth dream, they said, was they wanted justice. And I asked them, I said, what does justice mean? Because again, it seemed very remote sitting inside the brothels on the beds with the women. And they said, justice is basically we want those who had brokered away our dreams to be punished, those who bought us and sold us. And they wanted protection from the police because they said when we tried to escape from the brothels, nobody was there to watch out for them. When they were pulled out of schools and put into a brothel, nobody was there to watch out for them. And also, when they were in prostitution and standing on the streets because they had to, otherwise they would not get food that night, they were beaten up by the cops. So they said, we want justice. And we want justice meant accountability and protection. So fast forward, here we are now, 18 years later. And Apne Aap has grown, and it's now working all over India. Our biggest projects are in Bihar. we are organizing denotified tribes who were labeled as criminal tribes under British colonialism. And they are now suffering from intergenerational prostitution, the Nuts, the Bhedias, the Sasis, the Kanjars, and helping them to access their own rights by linking them to government IDs and subsidies, because all of them are undocumented, and connecting their children to school, and campaigning for changes in laws. So this is what we are trying to do at multiple levels, and this is the full story of how I'm here and why I'm here to talk to all of you. And Firdaus, would you also tell us about yourself and your journey?
My journey and my journey is like our journey. It's Naripokho's journey into involvement with sex workers and fighting for sex workers' rights. It began, if I want to put a date to it, it began in 1991, actually, with a newspaper report we read, which was in response, which the women, which was reporting a press conference, which the women of Tanbajar brothel, which was being evicted, had organized. And these women had put, in the press conference, had a leaflet which actually had said three things. We are women, we are citizens of Bangladesh, and we must enjoy all the rights of a citizen of Bangladesh. And we had been reading about the threat of eviction in this brothel and wondering, how do you stand beside these women, when we were just stunned by this very strong statement that were coming from the women in the brothels themselves. That's when we decided to get in touch with the women, and in our first meeting with the women, what impressed us, I mean, of course, I think some of my comrades, sisters are here in the audience, but all of us can testify that just walking inside a brothel was a life-changing experience for each one of us. Each one of us was touched somewhere, not just by the plight of the women in the brothel, but by the plight of women. It's as though we were all brothel residents. We were all, there was an identification with that life somewhere, I don't know how, but we felt at one with the women. And that I felt was the strength of going as an organization, not as an individual researcher or as an individual, but as a women's organization. So we had already gone with that pokkopatito, that we would take the side of the women, that we are on their side, they are on our side, we are one. But the thing that amazed us was that despite everything, to the women, life in the brothel was preferable to life outside the brothel. And they were fighting tooth and nail to keep those spaces for themselves. We did encounter all the oppressive elements that Ruchira has told us about, the kidnappings, the abductions, the breaking in of young women, the hierarchy in the brothel by which, you know, as you became senior, you became the Shardarni or the Khalamma who worked younger women under you. We could see the pimp standing guard while we were entering the brothel. We could see the pimps always, even as they came to Naripokho, the Naripokho office. We could look out and we could see these men walking up and down the street, so that they were constantly under guard and constantly under surveillance. We got all that feeling that this isn't a place of any kind of freedom. It is as controlled as any other site in which women perhaps exist. But this control is even more visible than in other spaces. But despite everything, the women were faced with eviction, with losing whatever space, whatever protection, whatever way of expressing their own wishes were. I'll never forget, we were sitting and talking to the leader of the movement, Rita, her name was, and while we were sitting there, you know, these rooms are all divided into, some activity was going on behind the bamboo partition, And suddenly this girl cries out, "He's biting me." And she says, "Don't you dare." And this kind of protection was also there. That there from across the thing, she just tells the customer, "Don't you dare bite." This kind of camaraderie, togetherness, which is not, I don't want to paint a happy picture that is all protection and love, and it's also exploitation and hierarchy and competition, etc., was there. So in that first round of organizing, of campaigning, the anti-eviction campaign, we succeeded. The eviction did not take place, and Tanbajar as a brothel continued to function. But what that foray or that little campaign got us as a women's organization, gave us an insight into women's lives, into the many aspects of women's lives. And as we got to know these women, we got to know the many ways in which women enter the sex work or sex trade, or women enter prostitution, as it is generally known. So there were stories of kidnappings, etc., but there were also stories of being lost, of just losing your parents, or parents selling you off, or being inveigled into, or walking into, street children walk into these things. And if you read the lives of these women, and if you follow the lives of these women, there is a toing and froing. There is a way that they come out, but there is always a going back. Somehow you just cannot get out completely. So one of the things that was discussed a lot in our conversations was the question of rehabilitation. Since, I think, the late 80s, 1988 onwards, there were huge government rehabilitation efforts, which these women had been resisting all the time. And to echo Ruchira's thing of their dreams, work in an office, I remember very clearly one woman got up and said that, "You talk about alternatives to sex work. What alternative can you give us? Would you give us a job in your husband's office?" And so this work in an office was very important, but also something that was impossible, that they knew that you could not get it. The rehabilitation center itself was a place of exploitation, where guards, where officers, where everybody took sexual services in lieu of no payment. And the conditions of living were worse than in the brothel, according to these women. The second avenue that opened us was for us to look at their other needs, to look at the needs of women. And of course, the first need was for their children to be educated. There was local schools would not take them because these are red light areas, very clearly demarcated, and the children come from there. And I must say that efforts to educate children have been undertaken, and one of the things that has happened, I think a very small effort on the part of one of our friends, is to open up a school in which the children of working mothers, it's called. And I know that some of these children are also studying. The educational establishments were set up within the precincts. And importantly, health services started to be given. This is the same, it coincided with the anti-AIDS thing that was happening all over the country and I suppose the region. And so women's health organizations, etc., could organize regular health checkups for women. So little ways of providing services within the brothels started being established. But as time went on, especially by the end of that decade, 1988, 1999, there was another eviction campaign. And this time, despite all efforts, the two main brothels in Dhaka and Narayanganj were evicted. And we have been following up women who were in the brothels and now are working out of the streets or in hotels. So the eviction of brothels did not result in any kind of improvement for the lives of these women. So our stress then had been to protect these women within the demarcated areas. And with that in mind, we had instituted a court case, a writ petition, asking the government why they had failed in providing security to these women. And the court case went in the favor of the women, and it said that brothels were legal areas where the sex trade could be practiced. But despite that, that protection could not be given. So while we were within this thing, sex workers themselves then started organizing for themselves. So now in Dhaka and in Bangladesh, you have sex workers organizations, and you have leaders that come from the work themselves and who identify themselves as sex workers and who fight for the rights of sex workers. There was, a few years ago, a sudden thing that now in our national ID card, profession can get down as sex worker. So we had thought, whoa. But then it was, within an hour of this announcement, it was retracted. So we still don't have that identification as a sex worker. But we had felt that to be recognized as a sex worker was important because it gave you certain rights, workers' rights. It gave you the right of protection, of asking the police for protection. Otherwise, you were just seen as somebody who was plying a trade that was not recognized in any way, and because you kind of stepped outside the purview of the law, you did not have any recourse to that law. So it's a very difficult subject for anyone, I think, to grapple with. I don't think anyone can stand up and say, I am for sex work. But the protection of the sex worker, the improvement of the condition of in their lives, future for their children, everything is something that I think all of society, and Nari Pokho as a women's group, needs to be concerned about, and this conversation needs to go on, because the eviction of our brothels has meant less security for the women engaged in sex work, and less ability to provide them services, and a decrease on our part to be able to access, to organize, to actually see what's happening. And this tendency of eviction of brothels is going on. And at the moment, there are very few brothels left in Bangladesh. One of the things that is driving these evictions is like the slum evictions in our country. The brothels are 150 years old, was Tanbajar. They're in very commercially lucrative and desirable locales. And with the new development going on, I think this form of sex work is giving way to a more fluid, diffuse, and unidentifiable arena in which this trade is plied. So that's, I think, the way that it is operating in Bangladesh. But what I would like Ruchira now to get in on is how her organization, Apne Aap, is looking at the various aspects that pertain to sex workers' lives or women in prostitution lives, and how do we as feminists, as organizers, as social organizers, deal with it?
Thank you, Firdaus. After listening to what Firdaus spoke about the situation in Bangladesh, I feel there is more in common than not. And there's a commonality in our inequalities which cut across not just the subcontinent but the whole world, which is the fact that women are less equal. So we have less access to office jobs, which both of us emphasize. It's like a distant reality. The fact that poor women are even more unequal. And in India, of course, we have the issue of caste, where mostly the women in prostitution are from certain castes. And all across the world, the other thing that we have equal is that the entry of people into prostitution, of females into prostitution, is mostly as girls. They are teenagers. So I have begun to call them the last girl. And the fact that she is the most destitute and the most marginalized, the weakest person I know, the 13-year-old in the brothel, and she's poor, female, low caste, and a teenager. And she exists everywhere. She could be a person of color in America and low caste in India and of certain ethnic minority in Bangladesh. So there is so much to look at in what is causing the whole system of prostitution to exist. And why are these women available in prostitution? And even if they get 4 or 5 years of a steady income, if at all, and there are huge public health consequences and both physical and mental trauma, they're still willing to go through it for a period of 4 to 5 years. What is it? Because there are no other options. So the way we in Apne Aap define prostitution is, we say prostitution is absence of choice. It's not a choice. At best, it's a survival strategy. And that is because of all these intertwining inequalities. So what we try to do is that we call our approach the last girl 10-asset approach. We try to help women in prostitution gain 10 assets, and we try to make sure that she gets the 10 assets at her doorstep. So we try to go to those girls who are at risk and those women who are at risk to prostitution, and also to those who are already prostituted, and try to create an exit strategy or reduce their vulnerability so that they're prevented from being trafficked. So the way we do vulnerability reduction is by linking them to schools, education, government IDs as citizens of India, teaching them how to campaign and seize the government subsidies which are there on paper, but very often corrupt local officials make sure they don't get it, the mukhias, the sarpanches, etc. And also how to file a case in a police station for protection from both the pimps and the police officers, and sometimes from boyfriends and husbands who are also pimping them, how to testify in court, so access justice. Our 10 assets are basically based on the 4 dreams that the women had, starting from a safe space to education, to self-esteem, to political skills, to legal skills, and friendship circles, consciousness-raising groups, and justice and livelihood linkages to government, and of course government subsidies and government entitlements. So this is how we are going about it, and over the years we've organized more than 21,000 girls and women in Bihar, Bengal, Delhi and Rajasthan to do so. But also what we have come across as we did our work for those was that we realized that prostitution is based on 2 pillars, supply and demand. So on one hand, you have supply of the most vulnerable girls in our society, and so they are the weakest of the weak, as I called it. And demand is of the buyers, clients. They are known as Johns. They are known as, in Bihar, the women in prostitution call them passengers, because they say they just come and ride us and go away. And so different names for them. And then the business. The business is, of course, the transporters, recruiters, pimps, brothel keepers, all of who are living off this one woman's body. And so we say that we have to address the supply by reducing risk or reducing vulnerability, and creating exit strategies by reducing dependency on the brothel, by linking women to subsidies, entitlements, and justice. But at the same time, we have to address the demand, because we see prostitution as a demand-driven industry. No 14-year-old girl gets up and decides, I'm going to grow up to be a prostitute. What happens is that somebody comes and tells her, you're starving, your father has to sell his kidney to support you or give you dowry, and let me find you a job in the big city, sometimes even saying that there is prostitution at the end of the line. And the girl may choose it because she doesn't see other options. So somebody is preying upon her vulnerability and taking advantage of, in Hindi we say, uski majboori ka fayda uthana. So koi uski majboori ka fayda uthata hai, and that's what happens again and again and again. So unless this trafficker, this buyer, this business is dismantled, whatever we do will be first aid. And therefore, after a lot of thinking, because I have probably the same friends and the same feminist circles as you, as we know. I used to think about it when I started the work, that should I use the term sex worker? And over the years, I stopped using the term sex worker, and I started using the term prostituted woman or prostituted child. And the reason was that I tried to compare, I wanted to convey to society as large, as a feminist campaigner, to activists, to policymakers, that this is an absence of choice. And I felt that the term sex worker would show that it was a job like any other job and people were making a free choice. So, and I felt it sterilized the exploitation out of the woman, the prostituted woman's life. I also compared it to any other kind of work that labor struggles have strived for over the years. And there were 4 things that I thought about as I went through this process of coming to this conclusion. The first was that all labor struggles all over the world always strive for minimum wages. In my work of 18 years across brothels across the world, and I work in India, but I've also traveled extensively in other countries across the world, and including inside the United States. And everywhere that I went, what I found was there's no such thing as minimum wages in prostitution. Your price comes down as you grow older. Your price comes down as the night grows older, because you have to get food on the table, and you have to have a customer. Otherwise, you won't be given anything to eat. And in the brothel systems where I work in Bihar, in Bombay, in Calcutta, in Delhi, it's basically, to describe it very, very simply, the life cycle of a prostituted woman can be divided into 4 phases. The first is, she's called chukri in Calcutta, and she's kept in debt bondage when she's between 9 and 13 years old for 4 or 5 years. And that's when she's used by the brothel manager the hardest. And she's told she's repaying the debt that her parents took to let her go, which could be 10,000, 15,000 rupees. But she is made to work for 8 or 10 customers every night. She's given nothing of what she earns, and the entire money is kept by the brothel manager. So she's basically a debt slave the first 5 years. The second 5 years, she's called a adhya, exactly like a sharecropper, bataidar in Bihar we call them. And so she is told, okay, you can keep half of what you earn. And that's when she begins to think she has a little bit of freedom, so she can go out on the street and stand, try to get some customers. But she has lost count because of the repeated body invasion inside the brothel for the first 5 years. She's suffering from trauma, and now research shows that women in prostitution suffer from trauma which is higher than returning war veterans, because of the repeated body invasion. And then she's got all kinds of diseases in the first 5 years because of, again, repeated body contact, from tuberculosis to jaundice to skin diseases to repeated abortions to insomnia, because she has to be available night or day. Forget AIDS. AIDS is just one more thing among all that she can get. Also suicide attempts and violence done to her body. Customers very often are not buying sex, they are buying violence. So all the women, all the girls across the world that I've met, from South Africa to United States to India, have talked about client violence. And they say, he stubbed cigarette butts out on me, or shoved bottles up my vagina. And in fact, some of them don't even think it's violence because he paid for it. So when I ask them, has anyone been violent with you? They'll say no. I'll say, nobody beats you. Hey, mara piti to hoy. Acha, what about fractures? At least 2 a month in our group of 60. What do they use any instruments? Hey, rod use kore. Murders are rampant. Even in Sonagachi, where women have organized, we just had to do a funeral for Sati Das, who joined our group. So the violence is extreme. There's all kinds of diseases which they get. Then there's seasoning, which Firdaus referred to right at the beginning. That, when a girl is just bought into a brothel, she's put through a period of seasoning. And the seasoning is, she's told to take drugs and alcohol so that she can cope with the repeated body invasion. She's beaten black and blue if she resists. She's told how to stop crying. It's horrible, the period of seasoning, so that she can become numb. And so by the time she's told, okay, now you're a adhya and you can keep half of what you earn, She's had a couple of diseases. She's had a few children. She's dependent on drugs and alcohol. She knows she has to pay protection money to the police officer, to the muscle man, all of the people who are protecting her. And she has to pay for the bed she sleeps on, the water she drinks, and she doesn't even know how to count because she was pulled out of her home when she was 12 or 13. And so basically what happens is she gets deeper into debt. She doesn't earn. It's a scam when they tell her that you can keep half of what you earn. But they do give her a little bit of money when she's going home at festival time. They'll say, oh, we'll give you a little bit. And that's what she feels is a lot by then. And then the third phase inside the life cycle of a prostituted woman is that she's told, okay, now you're a randi. You can earn everything, you can keep everything that you earn, but by then her commercial viability has come down. She's no longer fresh looking. She's like a caricature of her former self. She looks disease-ridden. She looks like a cardboard creature. She cannot attract customers. So she starts to perform S&M inside the brothels so that she can get some customers to eke out an existence. And that's when the brothel managers begin to tell her that if you don't replace yourself with your daughter, we are going to throw you out of the brothel. And that's when they come to organizations like ours, because they have little bit of flexibility and they say, oh, can you protect our daughters? Whatever has happened to us has happened. We want our daughters to be safe from the same fate. And it's really hard at that time to help because the trauma, the disease, everything is so much that it's really, really hard. And then, these are the 4 cycles. And then she basically dies on the sidewalk. So the mortality rates in a red light area are very high. They're disposable people. They've lost connection with their families. They don't know how to keep in touch with people. So very often there's not enough documentation on this. So this is why I thought there can be no minimum wages. They can also, this is not an occupation. The other thing that people in labor struggles have aspired for is old age pension. But in prostitution, there is no such thing as old age pension because you earn less with more experience and as you grow older. And basically, your old age pension is disease and death and the slavery of your child. So that doesn't happen. Then the third thing that labor struggles aspire for is working conditions. Now that was something I had to debate about a lot. That can, if we legalize brothels and if we legalize pimping and brothel keeping, will that help us regulate them and provide better working conditions, even in this 4-phase scenario, at least for 1 phase, for the prostituted woman or child? And in that too, what we found, and we looked at research, where brothels had been legalized and pimping had been legalized in places like Victoria, Alberta, Australia, and in Netherlands and Amsterdam, and in New Zealand. There are 3 places in the world where it's been legalized, and Germany. So, and Las Vegas, of course. So we looked at these places, and the research showed that actually, you could put in TV cameras and you could make the brothels cleaner and all of that. But ultimately, the prostituted woman had to be alone with the client or the John. And nothing, that violence that he did to her could not be legislated away. In fact, to the extent that even pillows had to be removed from the brothels of Victoria, Alberta, because by the time she would press the button for the bouncer, the customer would try to snuff her out. So ultimately that intimacy, because the man is buying body penetration, he is going to be alone with her. That could not be legislated away. And the 4th thing that labor struggles have aspired for has been dignity. And in prostitution, you have to sexualize your body every night, desexualize it in the day. You have to sexualize it up to a certain point, and then when it's time to leave or you're thrown out of the brothel by the brothel keeper because you're no longer commercially viable, then you have to desexualize yourself to exist in other parts of society, and you don't know how, you have no skills, you have diseases. So because of that, I thought that, I will not choose the term sex worker, which will give it the status of labor, because this is inherently exploitative. And the one thing which cannot be legislated away in prostitution, come what may, is body penetration. And the only people who understand the consequences of repeated body invasion or body penetration, and it makes it different from all other sweatshop work, are male prisoners. And that is why there are male prisoners organizing in some prisons all over the world to raise money for prostituted women and children so that their risk can be reduced, their dependency on the brothel system can be reduced, and they can exit out. So which is why initially I shifted from sex worker to woman in prostitution. Then I've now shifted to prostituted woman or prostituted child, because I want our language to influence our politics, and for us to think about the fact that something was done to her. Somebody took advantage of her vulnerabilities, and I don't want the state to be excused from investing in the most marginalized girls and women, the last girls as I talk about. So I think they need to invest in their education, in their housing, in their health, and the state is absolutely abdicating this, and we need to do that. In Germany, where prostitution was legalized, unemployed women were asked when they went to get dole that, have you tried prostitution? So think about the consequences when we do something like this. And what is happening is that post-GATT agreements and WTO agreements and all of that, prostitution was shifted into services, and that is when the whole term globally sex worker began to emerge. So it's a big global thing that is being pushed on us, and we are being brainwashed to believe it's about the fight for rights. It's actually the fight where we are actually going to dilute our rights. And the very nature of livelihood is at stake here, that what do we accept as livelihood and what we don't. It's really a very fundamental question that we are going into. And this debate is dividing the women's movement, which is making people so happy all over the world, whereas the women's movement and the environmental movements are the only two global movements we have right now, which can stand up to people, because we know what feminization of poverty means. More than anybody else, it's our lived reality. And finally, to come to AIDS, because I must talk about that very importantly, because I don't know when I'll have this audience to share these issues with, is the whole issue of AIDS. In my own country, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation wanted to help. There was a big outcry about 15 to 18 years ago, just when I made my documentary, that India is going to be the epicenter of AIDS. And WHO made certain projections, and India was going to be the big global capital of AIDS. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation said, oh, we want to help India prevent AIDS. And they hired consultants called McKinsey, and to help design a program to help India control AIDS. And the entire program design was for more than $600 million for a country like India. And when you throw that much money in a period of 10 years at a country like India without having a vision, you can imagine what happened. Everybody became a consultant, everybody became a grantee. There was nobody who was outside this realm. From our own Ministry of Health, from the National AIDS Control Organization, which was set up by our Ministry of Health to help us control AIDS. The entire program design was done by McKinsey. The rent was paid by McKinsey. The salaries were paid by McKinsey. And finally, what happened was that a whole web was created of the Public Health Foundation in the Prime Minister's office, which was funded by Gates Foundation. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation set up its own office in India. Their head got $450,000 a year as salary. And they funded 23 intermediary organizations like CARE and World Vision and God knows what else, funding 126 smaller NGOs like Population Services International and all of that. And then they funded a National AIDS Control Organization, which then funded all the State AIDS Control Society. And the entire target of all this was just condom distribution inside the red light areas. And what it did finally was that to distribute these condoms, people began to hire pimps and brothel keepers on salary inside the red light districts, and they became more powerful and more entrenched. So when apne aap my NGO would go to the police station and say that 19-year-old woman is being held hostage and she wants to go and become a TV star, and we are trying to get her an audition in a TV serial, and the brothel manager will not let her go for the audition, so you have to go to that pimp or the brothel manager, the police would tell us that this is NGO rivalry. He's a peer educator for that other NGO, which was DMSC, which was one of the vanguards of the pro-legalization movement in the world. And that went on. And in CARE, which came to Bangladesh to start working, articles in CARE said that if you go into a brothel and if you see a girl being exploited, don't say anything, don't do anything, because you'll upset the apple cart. You just distribute your condoms and come back. So the whole thing turned on its head, and basically the program was designed by 45-year-old men for 45-year-old customers, and to protect them from AIDS, while there was nothing to protect women and girls from the men. Nothing. There was no gender sensitization, but it was done in our name, that this is a gender-sensitive policy. And here we are so many years later when it's influenced our mindset, because everybody we know talks like that, everybody uses this language, every article written is like that, and all in the name of rights. And the rights paradigm has thrown basic needs out. And now my own Prime Minister in India wants to legalize pimping and brothel keeping. The new chair of his National Commission for Women has said that, because it's part of the whole neoliberal framework. And he has already got the cabinet to approve a bill to legalize child labor in family enterprises, which could also be home-based brothels, and in audiovisual industry. The cabinet has approved the bill. It's going to go to parliament soon. So this is where we are. When we lower the threshold, the end result, you cannot even imagine where it goes to. Organizations like Amnesty are saying that we want to legalize pimping and brothel keeping. There's no conversation about where are the state's investments in the basic needs of the girl child. Nothing. Of the last girl. There is absolutely nothing. So this is why I am, I travel relentlessly. I talk to anybody I can. I'm in Dhaka to do this conversation, because we are being hoodwinked. There's a big hoax being presented to us, and this will permeate into other things which are also going to happen in the name of rights. It will be the commodification of the most marginalized girls in the name of promoting our rights.
I have very little time, actually no time, to present why we think that that we need to protect the rights of these women. We need to protect the rights of sex workers. And that is because, talking about violence, in our interviews with sex workers, the most violence they face is from the police, from law enforcing agencies. And their thing is, because they have no rights, because they have no legal recognition, because they are out there and anything can be done. And in the name of public safety, in the name of public morality, their places of work, their places of residence, they can be evicted from it with impunity, because they are the marginalized. They are involved in work, which is not considered work, which is considered. So if you look at the cycle of exploitation, it's very difficult to know how to counter it. But in our activism, in our meetings, the question of rights was really the status on which women engaged in sex work wanted to place themselves. They wanted to see their work as work. And when they talked about work, they talked about conditions of work, improvement in conditions of work, of the cycle as they grew within the brothel system. What would their futures look like? How they would be able to save for the future. So many of the questions that Ruchira has, or many of the issues that she has presented to us, can be looked at from the arena of rights and looked at. On the question of demand and supply, this question completely comes to me all the time. This is about sex, and sex is about pleasure. So these Johns and these customers and whoever they are, what are they looking for if not pleasure? And where is this pleasure in this very, very exploitative system? Not just exploitative, it is dirty, it is poor, it is incredibly murky. But somewhere around the way, there is a pleasure nexus and cycle that is working. So instead of, I think it's very easy to dismiss things as exploitative, as cruel, as bad, and therefore needs to be just plucked out of our system. But it is also necessary to look at all these needs and desires that guide it, Of course, the woman, as Ruchira was calling them, the last woman, is perhaps at the end of that cycle and the most exploited. But if we look at the female body and the woman's body through the life cycle, and I'm trying to recall and remember the moment of identification in the brothel. Somewhere, I think all women should visit a brothel, because it is not something so separate from our lives. It is somewhere something we can all identify ourselves with. And the old adage that prostitution is the flip side of marriage, you can see that happening. So I really would like us all to think about what it is that drives the demand side, what it is that puts women's bodies at bay, and whether it is just limited to the woman who is actively engaged in sex work, or whether it is all of us put together who are part of this system as both men and women. And we need to look at it very seriously, because in countries like ours, where poverty reigns supreme, I mean, why is there child trafficking? Why is there trafficking in women's bodies? Why is the Nepalese woman taken to Bombay? Why is the Bangladeshi woman taken to Kerala? What is the supply there? So we have to look at women's lives and the conditions of women's lives, as well as the conditions that condition us towards a notion of sexuality, of sex and sexual pleasure, which involves all of us, men and women together, and where we are placed within that. When we talk about trafficking, it is not, as we see today, limited to women's bodies. The shiploads or the boatloads of people leaving our shores into uncertainty, and the kind of traffickers' rings that are behind them are also part of it. So I think it is a greater social problem which is perhaps not easily solved and easily dealt with, but there is, of course, a global politics being played, a global... I didn't know about McKinsey in India, but one of the things about the AIDS programs in our country is that at one point I remember we had to do a campaign that it's not the woman who's the carrier of disease, it's the woman who's the victim of disease, who's most vulnerable to becoming diseased herself, rather than, you know, it was being shown that these women are the carriers of disease. So with that, I would like to open it up. I think we have very little time for an audience intervention, but I would like some at least.
Can we take all the questions and then each of us can answer for 2 minutes each as a summary?
Can we have the lights on and can we have mics? We'll take everyone, as many as we can.
I am from Bangladesh and I'm from the AIDS movement, not the anti-AIDS movement, it's called the AIDS movement. And I know your Gates project, which is the Avahan project, which has done brilliant things for HIV. It's how you present things. But let's forget about all that. The issue here is, I think we're talking about 2 different things. One is about prevention into prostitution, as you're calling it, and one is about people who are in sex work already. We from the HIV world, we talk about harm reduction. And we are looking at a woman, whether it's a woman, whether it's a person who uses drug, whether it's a transgender, or a person who has another man who has a sex with man. It's all about how do we protect the individual. And health is not, can I? Okay, what I'm trying to say here is that exploitation is not in a vacuum. And your whole discussion is around sex work in brothels. Brothels are the least autonomous places for sex work. Women are moving out of brothels into the streets where it's more autonomy. I need you to answer my question. And that's why I have to look, women are selling sex in residences, in hotels where they have much more autonomy, and that's not always decided by sheer exploitation at the level that you're talking about in brothels. And we need to address sex work as a whole from the top to the bottom because it's a layer of exploitation.
If I can just come in, I think there has to be a way between what the two of you are saying, and I want to complicate slightly the concept of choice that Ruchira was putting forward, because I think Ruchira, with respect, it's here, it's Urvashi in this corner over here, yeah, can you see me? Yeah. So, full light. Okay. Anyway, you need to hear me. Let's so not to see necessarily. So I want to complicate this question of choice. I think one, choice is never static. So your young girl may go in because of a lack of choice, but there may come a point in her life when she might be exercising a choice under very different circumstances. Secondly, to extend that thing outside of prostitution, in our countries, women are married into marriages without any choice, and they do not necessarily remain permanent, choiceless victims in those marriages. Many do, many don't. And thirdly, if you insist on conceptualizing the woman in a job or in a situation of prostitution inside brothels as always a victim lacking any agency and therefore somebody whose interests have to be looked after by the state, you're down a very slippery slope, because that is the argument that our states will make to say the rape victim or survivor, being a woman, does not really know what she wants. That is the argument they made at partition when they put hundreds and thousands of women inside families and inside rehabilitation homes, because they said the women don't really know what they want and they cannot exercise choice. So I think that underlying what you're saying, there are a lot of conceptual things that really need to be clarified, and they're not as clear as the black and whites in which you're outlining them. I think between what the two of you are saying, there are many things which are very ambivalent.
Yes. I wanted to ask a very short question. This enormous problem that you have outlined very brilliantly for us, I wonder how was this dealt with after the revolution in Mao Zedong's China?
I'll take the question then. Short question from me too. That was pretty short. Well, thank you for that. But my question is, you talked a little about the demand side of prostitution, but you didn't really get into what factors they are. Would you please talk about that a little bit?
There's one there. There's one there.
Hi. My question will be very short too. The question I had is that I wonder when, you talked about sex work in the context of neoliberal economy, capitalism, whatnot. But if we actually look at these structural issues, we are constantly selling something, right? We are selling our brains. We are in the business, right, of selling whatever we want to survive. So I wonder why this moral panic when it comes to sex work specifically. Why? Thank you.
Man there.
Okay, sure. My question is particularly in the South, the sex workers often think of as a victim, as agent, binary mode. So my question is, in the context of global South, how do you deconstruct this agent and victim binary mode and to empower women, sex workers?
I've got another question here. A very short one. Thank you for coming up with a better word, but what about the assumption that sex workers can only be women, and thus coming up with the word that it's only prostituted women? Why this sexist assumption?
Shall we start? Yes. So how much time do each of us have? We have to finish before 3:30.
And what's the time? What's the time now? So we have 5 minutes each, right? If I leave out someone's question, then you can just raise your hand because once I look at you, I'll remember the point you mentioned. I don't know about China and what happened with Mao Zedong after Mao Zedong. I'll go back and study it and try and find out, but I don't know right now. To answer your question about Avahan, yes, Avahan was a good program because it set up a whole system, and that's a good public health system which it created. But because it was based on the harm reduction model rather than the harm eradication model, in some places it entrenched the harm further, which we found as our lived reality in some of the red light districts we work. And so the data was also collected by one person being funded by Gates Foundation. The program was also being implemented by another branch which was funded by Gates Foundation. The conferences were also being funded by Gates Foundation. So everything became one big monopoly. And I have had meetings with the head of your Gates Foundation, both in Delhi and in New York and in Seattle. And they did think that, yes, this needed to become more inclusive. And we have been negotiating and talking with people inside the Gates Foundation because we don't believe it was intended. It is an unintended consequence. And the fact is that more and more women and girls are in harm's way. And the people who control them in the areas that I work in, which I'm absolutely witness to, are more powerful as a result of the funding they got from Gates. So that is a very, very obvious reality we saw, and I quoted one example to you. And we never had the resources and the funds of the Gates Foundation to document our data as much as you. But I was in touch with women and girls' real lives, and I knew their lived realities and lived experiences. And for me, the flesh and blood is as important as the data. I can't go on scale. I'll talk to you again because everyone's questions have to be answered. And the harm reduction model has to be in the harm eradication framework. And this is something which is a longer debate because we are also talking about looking at things called SMART. And that is SMART goals, which are specific, measurable, results-oriented, achievable, and time-bound. What they do is they make us to go for harm reduction or harm mitigation rather than harm eradication. And because of that, we very often ignore the last girl as I'm calling her, because we go for the lowest hanging fruit. We go for quantitative data. We go for things, so we always skim the top of the bottom, because that can be specific. We go for technology. We go for products. We don't go for intangible change. And that has been causing more and more harm, and we'll have to think about these things very seriously. So that is one thing. And to Urvashi's points, of course, Urvashi, you're right. And the fact is that we could not cover all the nuances, and we had the time we had. So these were broad brush strokes, and yes, in the lifespan of someone who is trapped in prostitution or going through a whole cycle, there are different things which happen at different moments. At one point you have no agency, then you have a little agency, which is why the term adhiya comes in, that you have a little bit of agency, or like a sharecropper. You can keep some, give away some. So yes, and there's even more than that. But I was just trying to paint broad brushstrokes because there's this much time. But of course, you're right. And in terms of men, somebody asked that why did we not use the term prostituted people? We should. And because increasingly there are more and more boys and men who are being prostituted. And right now the percentage of women is higher because of the feminization of poverty. But, it's also boys are being brought in and being sold. But the customers are mostly men, wherever I've gone. I have come across instances in Bangkok where I've met some female buyers, but mostly men everywhere. And what else was the question? I've forgotten. Demand. What was your question? Okay, actually, she raised a more interesting point on demand, so I will let her talk about it. The whole question of masculinity. That are they looking for sex? Are they looking for, because they don't have access, or are they looking for domination? I think the men who are coming to the brothels are buying domination because there's so much violence. Why are they so violent to the prostituted women? But maybe they think that sex is connected to violence, and that is a deeper question then. Because if that's what they've begun to believe, where did they get it? Did they get it from the porn videos they were watching, where the narrative is penetration? The girl is saying no, but she means yes, or she's saying yes means no, she's crying. So we don't know where this masculinity is being created. But Gloria Steinem, I want to mention her. once at least, is that she has proposed something to unite the women's movement rather than divide it, which she calls the third way, in which she says we decriminalize the women, recognizing the fact that for many it's a survival strategy, and the fact that, yes, there is absence of choices, but within that they're doing what they can. So they should not be punished. So we decriminalize the women completely, criminalize the traffickers, and penalize the Johns. So education programs, fines, penalties, and then for repeat offenders, higher punishments. So I just want to end with that.
I was very taken in the question that why, when we sell our bodies, there's a moral outrage, and that. And when we sell our brains, there is no moral outrage as well. So that in a way, this moral outrage is something that we have to get out of and look at how people live their lives. What are the avenues by which people can live their lives? And I agree with this question of choice, that each one of us has a set of choices, more limited for some and less and more open for others. And it is poverty that lessens the choice. It is poverty that really keeps us trapped in certain situations and does not give us a way out. But even when we talk about choice, we have to talk about women. Women's choices are limited. As Urvashi pointed out, the women who are married off at the age of 9 and 10, what choice does that woman have? But in the journey through life, our choices and our arena of choices perhaps also may change. Our agency, somebody asked the question about agency and victim, and that is the thing that I felt, or we in Naripokho felt when we were part of the sex workers movement, that our whole effort was to ascribe agency to women in sex work, not to look at them as victims whom we were rescuing, but as fellow strugglers in a very sexist world, in a world that is very skewed against women, to get some kind of justice, some kind of freedom, some kind of dignity. And that's all we were concerned with. Before we end, we have to end, but I think the last word should go to Ruchira.
Just some points that I forgot to mention when somebody was talking about morality. The morality here is about the morality of exploitation that I was talking about. And body penetration has its own consequences, which is different from any other kind of sweatshop work. It has mental and physical consequences which last into a whole lifetime, which cannot be legislated away. So the issue is about what do we accept, something which is inherently exploitative as a livelihood, or should we keep campaigning against it while recognizing the dignity of the women who are trapped in prostitution? So this is why we keep talking about the third way.